Hello everyone and welcome to today's training seminar. My name is Travis Cox and I'm the Director of Training and Support Services here for Inductive Automation. And I'm going to take you through today's session. We're going to focus on transaction groups here. We're going to do part one of a two-part series of transaction groups. Transaction groups may be a new feature or a new subset of Ignition that you guys haven't went over yet, but we're going to learn all about those here today. So again, this is the fifth session of a 14-part series, and each session focuses on a different aspect of Ignition. So again, we're going to focus on transaction groups. We're going to learn about what they are, how you can configure them, and kind of what they're really used for. All right, let's get started. First thing I want to talk about here is really what is a transaction group. It's a new concept to most of you. But transaction groups are the heart of the SQL Bridge module. So when you add the SQL Bridge module to Ignition, you get these transaction groups. And they are basically units of execution that perform a variety of actions, such as storing historical data, synchronizing database values with OPC values, or loading recipe values to your system, loading downtime, storing downtime information to your database. That's what these are kind of the kinds of things you use transaction groups for. So there are a variety of group types, item types, and options that transaction groups can be configured to accomplish almost any task. So we can kind of think of a transaction group as a black box, if you will. And a black box is where you can configure all of your logic. You take inputs, you have inputs to that box, and you have outputs to that box. And the inputs and the outputs can be from the PLC or from the database. They can go to the PLC or go to the database. So it's really all about learning how you can configure that black box to get the actual functionality that you're looking for. So we have four main types of groups that you can use, and they all offer different types of functionality. We have the historical group to log historical data to your database. A standard group, which allows you to either insert or update records in your database, or you can just use the standard group to do logic internally. There's a block data group that allows you to log huge blocks of data to your database. And we have a stored procedure group to interface with stored procedures of your database. So these are the four types of groups that we have, and we're going to look at each one of these individually and see an example of them, and more information of how you can configure each of these groups. So the first group I'd like to go over is the historical group. The historical group makes it easy to quickly log data historically to a SQL database. So this group actually inserts records of data into a SQL database, mapping items to columns. So it has full support for triggering, expression items, hour and event meters, and more. That means that you can also set up complex historical transactions. Unlike the standard group, which we'll see in a second, the historical group cannot update rows. It only does insertions. And it also cannot write back to items, and we'll see other groups that can do this. So the main use of a historical group is to take data from OPC items and store it into our database over time. The second type of group is the standard group. And this is the basic type of group that we have in Ignition, and it provides most of the functionality that you're looking for. It's a very flexible and the general use group that can be adapted to a variety of situations. The data model is a row-based, which items mapping to columns, and the data corresponding to a specific row of a table. So essentially, the standard group allows you to map data from OPC to a specific column in the database, or we can map data from OPC back to OPC. So the standard group allows or contains items who may be mapped to the database or used internally for features such as triggering or handshakes. Items who are mapped to the database target a specific column of a single specific row, chosen according to the group settings. Items can be mapped in a one-way fashion or bidirectionally. in which the value of the database and the item will be synchronized. The group may also insert rows instead of updating a specific row. In this manner, data can be inserted for historical purposes on a timer with an optional trigger. So the standard group can do what the historical group can do, but it does a lot more. So you have the ability to not only insert records, you can update records in your database. You can have the group just take data from OPC and write it back to OPC. You can synchronize databases to PLCs. You can synchronize databases, or like you can take data from the database right down to the PLC. All these things you can do with the standard group. And so the reason we made the historical group instead of just keeping the standard was so that the historical group means more, and you have an icon that knows that it's storing history versus a standard group that has a setting to either insert or update records in your database. So again, we'll see an example of this. So that's the basic use of a standard group. The next one here is a block data group. The block data group is a group that writes blocks of data to a table consisting of multiple rows and multiple columns. You can sort of think of the block group as turning a database table on its side. And so you can have a block. Basically, a block group will contain one or more block items. Each block item maps to a column in the group's table and then defines any number of values, OPC or SQL tag items, that will be written vertically as rows under that column. So this way, it's very useful for things like arrays. If you have an array of 2 arrays, array 1 has 50 elements and array 2 that has 50 elements, each of those 2 arrays can be columns. You have 2 columns in your database table, and the 50 elements be written as rows. And so we'll get into the example of this. But this group is very efficient and can be used to store massive amounts of data to the database. For example, 100 columns can, each with 100 rows, meaning 100,000 data points, will often take only a few hundred milliseconds to write, depending on the database. So it could be a lot more efficient than writing one record at a time. Here we can write multiple records at a time. That's what's different from the standard or the historical groups. So like the standard group, the block group can insert a new block, or it can update the first, last, or a custom block. So additionally, the group can be set to only insert records that have changed in the block if you want as well. So a lot of settings you can do with it. But the main idea here is to log huge blocks of data to your database. The last group we have is the store procedure. The store procedure group is similar to the other groups in terms of execution and triggering and the item configuration. However, the primary difference is that unlike the other group types, the target is not a database table, but instead a store procedure. So we can interface with these store procedures of our database. And items in the group can be mapped to input or output parameters of the procedure. They can also be bound to output parameters, in which case the value returned from the procedure will be written to the item. So the items can be bound to both an input and output at the same time. So this group is very useful when you have store procedures already written in your database that you want to interface with naturally. So those are the 4 different types of groups. Historical group, again, is to log data to your database. The standard group allows you to either update or insert records in your database. You can also make the standard group not interface to the database at all and go PLC to PLC if you'd like. The block data group allows you to log huge blocks of data to your database. And the store procedure group here allows you to interface with those store procedures. So with these 4 types of groups, the sky is the limit in how you want to configure it. But it's really learning how to configure it that will make it useful in your scenario. Because we don't have any, the groups are just, these are the 4 types of groups we have. There's no predefined groups for recipe management or downtime tracking or anything like that. You kind of have to configure these groups in conjunction with each other in order to achieve that functionality. So let's look more at the actual groups themselves and look at a few of the common settings that each of these groups have. All these groups that I just mentioned will have an update rate. The update rate is how often that group is going to evaluate. So for a number of reasons, the group may not execute during that evaluation. And the most common reason for this is a trigger. But the update rate is how often that group is going to evaluate. Secondly, here we have the data source. every group can interface with some database. So the data source is the connection, the database connection, to use for the group. This is the connection inside of Ignition. You can also just set it to the default, which will use the default connection for the project. So whatever database you have attached to the project as the default database will be used by default on the group. Groups will also have an update mode. So not all the groups support this, but it is important to know what the update mode is. And this sets the default for how items are going to map to their targets, meaning are they going to insert records in your database or update records in your database. And so the historical group already has an update mode, but it's implied. It's going to insert records in your database. The standard group you can select, either inserting or updating. And we'll see an example of this here really shortly. We also have the ability to store timestamps on these groups. So you can store a timestamp along with the data anytime the group executes. So that way we can not only see when the values are updated or when they're inserted when we graph the data or show it in the table inside of the actual project. So we have that option on the group, and we'll see where that is in a few seconds as well. And lastly, we have the ability to store the quality code. So this can store an aggregate quality for the group along with the regular data. So this quality is very useful, and so you can see whether or not you can trust the values that are put into your database from this group. So these are the common settings. So the most important setting here to note is the update rate. And we're going to look at how the group actually executes. So the update rate is how often that group is going to evaluate. So you can set it to say every 1 second. The group's going to try to do something every 1 second. And that something that's going to do is dependent on what you configure in that black box, if you will. So I talked a lot about items earlier, and all the different groups. I said items. Items, well, what are these? Items are the core elements of a group. They're executed, and the values are then used by the group for logic purposes, by other items, and to write to the database. They can be written to or from the database or from other items. So there are really 4 types of items you can use in a group. An OPC item, which is maps directly to a PLC value. An expression item that can be run always or on trigger. So they have 2 different types of expression items, and we'll look at exactly what those are. But expression items allow you to really do an expression, some logic expression or SQL query within the group. Or we can have a SQL tag reference, to reference some SQL tag that we have set up in our SQL tags database. So let's look at each one of these individually, but because these items are very important, and the items represent the values that are going to be used to go to the database or to go to the PLC. Those are the outputs and the inputs of these groups. So the first one here is an OPC item. Well, that item is directly subscribed to an OPC server at the rate of the group. And so it's executed by the group, so the alerts are evaluated when the group is executed. These items are executed even when the trigger isn't active. So OPC items, the most important thing to note here is that when you bring in OPC items into a group, those items are going to be subscribed or from the OPC server at the rate of the group. So if your group is every 3 seconds, then you're going to subscribe and try to read from the OPC value every 3 seconds, which will differ from the SQL tag value that you can actually bring in, the SQL tag reference. We'll see that in a second here. We also have expression items, which are, we call here run always. This is very similar to an expression SQL tag and can be either a static value, an expression, or a database query. And the run always part of it means that the items are evaluated at each group interval before the trigger state is evaluated. So this means that these expression items are going to run at the same rate of the group. If you have a group set to every 3 seconds, this expression item, that expression will evaluate every 3 seconds, giving you the output that you can use within that group. So things you can use an expression item for are triggers or handshakes or writing values back to the PLC. These are things you can use the expression items for. And just run always means it'll run the same rate of the group versus a non-trigger. So it's the same as the run always expression item, except that they're only executed when the trigger has been evaluated and is active. So once that trigger is, if you have you're waiting for a bit to go high in the PLC, once that bit goes high, then the expression item will evaluate, giving you that value. And lastly, you can have a SQL tag reference. And this is a reference to a SQL tag in your SQL tags database. And it allows the SQL tag to be used in a group like any other item, except that the tag is evaluated by its scan class instead of the actual group. So this is very different from the OPC item that you have that I showed first, where the OPC items are subscribed by the group at the rate of the group. These SQL tags are subscribed by the scan class and are updating at the rate of the scan class. So you may have two conflicting actual update rates. You may have one on the scan class that says how fast that tag is being updated, and you may have one on the group, which is how fast that group is going to run. So these, of course, are not recommended to be used inside of a group, and you definitely want to use OPC items in the groups, but there are times and purposes of using SQL tags in an actual group. So it is very easy to confuse the definition and the purpose of these two. They have distinct benefits and the pros and cons of each, right? SQL tags may be referenced inside of groups. However, it's critical to remember that they are executed by the ignition gateway according to their scan classes and independently of the group. Adding a SQL tag into a group is like creating a shortcut to that tag. That's kind of the biggest benefit of using SQL tag references. It's like a shortcut to the tag, and that tag, the address of that tag can be whatever you like in the SQL tag database, and can be changed on the fly, not having to edit the actual group. So there are pros and cons, but definitely if you're new to the groups, you want to use the OPC items, and it's very easy to confuse or use the wrong ones when you're configuring your group. And we'll see that in a second here as well. All right, so I talked a lot about triggers. So what is a trigger? Well, the trigger settings determine when a group is actually going to execute. So the group is going to run at some rate, say every 3 seconds, and it's going to check a triggering condition. So they're examined each time that group evaluates. So according to the update rate of the group, if they pass, the group will then run and perform the action. Otherwise, it just will stop right then and there. The trigger settings are the same for all group types. They're found on the second tab labeled trigger, and we'll see that in the designer here in a few. And there are really two types of triggers. One where it only execute on change when any of the items in that group have changed. That's what we call an async update trigger. And it can be on a single item, or it can be on all of the items in the group, or a subset of those items. So we can listen for when certain items change, and when they change, we can then execute that group, which is different from executing the group on a specific item in the group. So if you execute on a specific item, you can set, maybe when that value is equal to 1, or when it's equal to 0, or you can have your own settings when it's equal to 500. You have more control of what the actual value or the expression should be. And at the very end of the group, we have a handshake setting. So the handshakes are also defined on that trigger tab, and it's possible to specify both a success and failure handshake. So what this really is that once the group completes successfully or it fails, a value will get written to some item that you have in the group when it's finished executing. So the success handshake will write the specified value to the given item when the group has finished and all the triggered execution without any errors. Otherwise, the failure handshake will be written when the group execution is cut short due to an error, such as an error writing to a database or to an OPC item, whatever it may be, or your expression doesn't evaluate correctly. Then we'll know if that group failed. You can write that on failure. To kind of bring all of these things together, last thing I want to talk about here is the execution cycle of a group. And this will be the last PowerPoint slide, and we'll get into the examples and showing you how you can configure these groups in the designer. But this is very, very important to understand when you're working with these groups. So all of these groups follow a similar execution cycle, and this is the core evaluation may differ, but the general cycle is the same for all these groups that I talked about. And so the real basis is every group is running at the update rate. And the update rate could be 1 second, 3 seconds. And that update rate is, we're going to call that a timer. And so that timer is going to continually go on forever while that group is enabled. So when that timer executes, every 1 second, that timer will execute, where the group will then enter execution. If the group is paused, of course, it'll break execution. But after that, it'll evaluate all of the run always items, OPC items, SQL tag references, and expression items that are set to ignore the trigger. So once that group executes or enters execution, it's going to evaluate all the items. Those are going to be all of the inputs to that group. It's going to evaluate all of those. And they can also possibly be outputs, right? It's then going to check and see if that trigger is set or active. If there's a trigger defined, if there's no trigger defined, it's going to continue on. But if there is a trigger, it's going to wait for that trigger to be active. If there's a trigger defined and it's not active, of course, the execution will then break. And then once the trigger is actually active, then all of the triggered expression items will then run. So then all those expression items that are set to on trigger, once it's active, will then evaluate, get those values. And of course, lastly, we're going to compare these values between items and the targets. If they differ in any way, those values are going to get written to the database or written back to the PLC. We'll report any alerts that may happen along the way. And of course, at the very end, we're going to acknowledge the trigger, it's applicable, and write those handshake values. So the biggest thing that I want to make sure you guys understand is that these groups are going to run at the update rate. Every 1 second, they're going to then enter that group execution, checking for a trigger. If that trigger is defined, of course, it'll then see if it's active. If it's not defined, it'll just continue on. And the items there, the OPC items or the expression items are going to evaluate, and those values that can be used to either write to a database or back to the PLC. That's going to be the actual logic or the finished execution of that group, is what it's going to do with those items. All right, so I talked a lot about these groups here in the PowerPoints. Now let's take a look at these in the actual designer and how you can configure them and really see them in action. So again, I talked with all these PowerPoints. I know I went over a lot of things pretty fast. Please, if you have any questions, enter them into the GoToWebinar console. We'll get to those at the end. I'll allow 15 to 20 minutes this time for questions. And remember, this is part 1 of 2. We'll dive into more specifics and more advanced features of these groups on next week. So let's take a look at these actual groups. I'm going to open up my Ignition Gateway homepage here in Firefox. I'm going to launch my designer. Because I have the SQL Bridge module configured or installed on this Ignition Gateway. And by having that SQL Bridge module installed, I have the ability to create these transaction groups. So that's why I see the transaction groups here on the home page, and all of the groups are configured inside the designer. So we have to open up the designer inside of our project. So here's our project called Training. I can then open it up and store those groups inside of it. Now, one thing to note here before I go into the designer is that the project you open up is where those groups are going to be stored. So say that project can contain groups and can contain windows. And so this means that anytime you make a change to your groups, all of your clients, if you have Windows configured, all of your clients are going to get a notification that the update has been made. And a lot of people don't want that. They kind of want to separate the groups out from the windows. And if you want to do that, go ahead and create more than one project. One project for just your groups and one project for all the windows. So that way you can make changes to them independently, and they're not going to affect that update notification on those clients. So one important thing to mention there. So I'm going to open up my training project here. And if we're looking at the top left in our project browser, we have a section here for transaction groups. And this is where all of that is going to be configured. So we're going to spend all the time in this transaction group section, and here is where I'll configure one or more of these different types of groups. So the first thing I will do here is right-click on the transaction groups, and I can then create folders or one of those 4 different types of groups that we have. So of course we have the historical group, standard group, block data group, and store procedure group. These are all the different types of groups you can use. And of course you can organize these groups into folders if you'd like to. If you want to have a folder here for history groups, you can do that and then create a group inside of that folder. So it's kind of important to not only organize your groups into different folders, but to give each of those groups a specific name so that you know what that group is actually doing, what's the function of that group. So I'm going to create a historical group. The first thing I want to do is take some data from the PLC and put it into our database, say every 3 seconds. And so the first thing I need to do is create the actual historical group. I can then rename the group to history or whatever I'd like. And then I can start adding items to the group, because the items are really the core of the group. So I come down here in the bottom left is my OPC browser. So the OPC browser is where I can see all of the tags directly from the OPC server. Now this is certainly different from the SQL tags tab. So we have both these tabs down here on the bottom left. Remember earlier when I said you can add not only OPC items, you can add SQL tag references. And there are pros and cons of each. Of course, we recommend using OPC items, which means you have to drag it from the OPC tab. If you want to add a SQL tag reference, you can drag it from the SQL tag tab. This can be a confusing point for most people, but once you're in the designer, make sure you are at the right tab with the right items that you want to use. So I want to use it from my OPC tab, and I can then come over here to my sign folder. I can just take all 5 of these sign tags and drag them into the group. And you'll see once I drag those items into the group, here's all the 5 items. They are OPC items. And that's why they're in the basic OPC group items at the top. So all the different types of items, OPC items will be at the top, run always expression items will be in the middle, and triggered expression items will be at the bottom. So right away we can see where these different types of items go. And each of these items are going to have values that we can do something with. And so that's why we can see the value right here. And the values will be NA when either the group is disabled or not running, or if they're expression items that haven't actually executed yet. So this group is not running right now, but I'm basically configuring the group first. So I take those 5 items in here. These are going to be my items that I want to write to my database. So once I have those items in here, I go over to the right-hand side, and I have my Action, Trigger, and Options tabs. The Action tab is where you can configure those common settings, like the update rate, the data source, the actual table that you want to interface with into your database. If you want to store timestamps, you want to store quality codes, what the actual update mode of the group is, all this configuration is over here on the right-hand side. So for the historical group, I can choose to run the group at this update rate right here. I can say, let's run the group every 3 seconds. I can then go to some data source, which I can select my MySQL database because I want to log it to that database. And I can specify some database table name. So I can say I want to interface into a table in my database called history. So once I type that in, I can have the SQL Bridge module or Ignition here create the tables for me automatically. I can store my timestamp into a column here called timestamp in my database. I can also store quality codes, and basically just by checking these boxes over here. So I'll store my quality code into a column here called quality code. Because this group is historical, I also have the option down here to delete records older than a specific period of time. So I can say, oh, hey, keep or delete records older than 30 days. Because I don't need any data past that. So that way the table doesn't continually grow, but that way you can kind of just purge it every now and then. So that's basically it for the configuration. I'm going to set it to run every 3 seconds, go into my database, MySQL database, to a table here called history, using these items here. These are the inputs and the outputs. So I'm bringing these items from the PLC and writing them to my database. So now that I have that, I can come over here, and you'll see that right above the group I have these buttons, Enabled, Disabled, and Pause. By default, the group is going to be disabled, which means that it's not going to be running. So I can save my project, and down here at the bottom you can see under Status, the total execution is 0. So it's not running right now at all. Until I press the Enable button. Once I press Enabled, I then need to save the project in my designer. So when I save the project, now you can see down here that it's running, and we can see when these values were actually last executed. So here we can see total executions is 3, 4. Every 3 seconds, this group here is going to run. And because I don't have any trigger here set up, there's no trigger set up on the group, this group is going to run every 3 seconds no matter what. So let's kind of look at the database and see what this group did. Again, it created the table for me automatically in my database. And if you see the table here, the table is called History, over here on the right. It's called History, and Ignition basically created a column for every individual OPC item that's writing to the database. So the columns here are sign 1, sign 2, sign 3, sign 4, sign 5. We also have a timestamp. We have a quality code. By checking those boxes, so I can not only see the time which those values were inserted, I can see if the quality code is good, meaning that those values, I can trust those values. If I auto-refresh this, you'll see that every 3 seconds, another record gets inserted into that table. So this group is now running at that rate. And so we have 25, 26, and so on. But how did Ignition know how to create this table? And can I change these column names? Sign 1, sign 2, sign 3, sign 4, sign 5. Basically, what did it do here to create this table? Well, anytime Ignition is going to create a table based on a group, that table, of course, has to have a primary key. So Ignition is going to create the first column as the table name underscore NDX, which is the primary key that's set to auto-increment, so that way every row is unique. After that, it's going to create a column for every item that's set to write to the database as their target. And then lastly, they have the columns for the timestamp and quality code if you have those checkboxes checked. Let's come back to the group here for a second and look on the right-hand side. It's going to automatically create the table, and the primary key is going to be called history underscore NDX by default, which is a table name underscore NDX, but you could override that and change it right here if you'd like. The timestamp and the quality code, here's once you have those checked, here's the name of the column it's going to write to. And then lastly, all the OPC items here, if I look at these 5 OPC items, there's a target name. The target name is important. This icon here represents that's going to a database instead of going to PLC value. And the name is what is the actual name of the column it's going to create. So sign 1, sign 2, sign 3, sign 4, and sign 5. There they all are. And if I go edit this, the sign 1 value, you can see all of the items or the properties for this specific item. So every item that you bring into a group, whether it be OPC or SQL tag, references, or expression items, are going to have these properties, like, of course, the name of the item and the expression or where it's coming from on the PLC. And then down at the very bottom, you'll see the target type is set to a database field, and it's going to a table, the name called sign 1. So the target type of an item is basically, once that group executes, is where is that value going to be stored? Is it going to be set to none, where it's going to be then just be read-only in the group? Is it going to go to a database field? And on a standard group, we can also then go to a PLC value. So once that item executes, it's going to the target is where it's going to that value is going to be sent. And so you can see all that right here on the items. So we'll look at more of these settings here on part 2, but we have things like we can do hour meters and event meters off of these values. We can scale the tag or the values linear or square root. We can also do alerting on these items. So the basis here is once we have these items in the group, I can then set them over here to the right to put it into my database. Now the group right now is running every 3 seconds, but sometimes you want to run it based on some, based on some condition. So let's actually do this. Let's drag a writable integer 1 into the group. And I want to say when this writable integer 1 goes to a 1, then I want the group to execute. While it's a 0, I don't want anything to happen. So I can edit this item here. I can call this my trigger. And down here, the target type, I don't want to write this to my database. I only want to use it as part of the group. So I can make the target type none or just read only. As soon as I do that, here you can see there's my trigger. It's read only. And now to use this as a trigger, I then go to my trigger tab over here in my tabs. So I go to my trigger tab here. I can then do one of the two different types of triggers. The only evaluate when values have changed, or the async update, where I can select which tags to watch, or I can do it based on a specific item of this group. So I'm going to say let's execute this group off a trigger and select our trigger item. And here down at the bottom is where we can set up the condition for when that trigger is going to make the group actually execute. So I can say, hey, when that trigger condition is greater than 0, or in this case when equals to a 1, I want the group to run. So as soon as I check that and press save, so every time you make a change to the group, you have to press save. And once it comes through, so right now the value is 0. So if I were to go to my database, and let's do a little query here that's like select count star, so we can see how many rows are in there. Whoa. Let me close this for a second here. So let's do this again. Select count star. Got some painting issues here due to GoToWebinar. So here we can see there's 117 rows, and it's not getting any bigger. So this count here is not growing by any means because that triggering condition is not active right now. So the group is running every 3 seconds, but because that condition is false, it's not finishing execution. I mean, it's not going to take the data and write it to the database or whatever your logic is set up with the group. But as soon as that condition was to go true, so if I write a value down, right to the item, I can write a 1. Now the condition is going to be met. So once it writes, now the condition is met. If I go look at my database and refresh this data here, you'll see that there's 119 rows, 120. It is now executing and inserting the values the whole time that the trigger is now active. So that's kind of what really important on the execution of the group. And on the trigger tab, we have options. If you just look in here, on this, we have options to maybe only execute the group once when the trigger is active. We can reset triggers after execution. So I can have the group, I can force the group to write a 0 or 1 back to the trigger value. I can prevent the trigger caused by when the group starts. So if you don't, when you start the group up and the trigger may already be active, you may not want the group to execute, and you can check that box there to prevent that. But these are where all the trigger settings are. And these triggers are pretty much in common just as when that group is actually going to finish the execution. And lastly, down here we have the write handshakes on success or on failure. So if I had another writable integer I can put into this group here, I can say write handshake on success to writable integer 2, and I can write any value I want, like 10. I can also write to the same item on failure and write like 15 if I want to. And I can just set these here on the group as well, press save, and you'll see as soon as the group actually executes successfully, which it will here in a second, the writable integer 2 value is going to get written, a 10 will get written down to it, and there you go. There's my 10. I'm also storing that item in the database, but I could just make it read only, in which case it won't go into my database at all. So the last thing I want to look at here before we go to the Q&A is the expression items. So I talked about how there's run always versus on trigger expression items. Now the expression items are very powerful. You can right click and create a new one of them right here in the group. I create OBC items, expression items, or SQL tag references. I'm going to create an expression item. The expression items are going to have a name as well. So just like the OBC items, they're going to have a name, like I call this my EXPR. I can give it a data type. So whatever my data type is going to be, we'll say it's int4. And you can specify a static value right here, or the value can come from an expression or an SQL query. And just like the OBC item, we have the ability to evaluate, or to, on the right target, to either be read-only, go to a database field, or write back to another PLC value or other tag, essentially. So I can say on this item, let's write to our database field. We'll call it EXPR. And now I can make this this checkbox right here is make it run always versus an on trigger. If I check this, it's going to run at the same rate of the group. If it's unchecked, it's going to wait for the trigger to actually execute. So we'll see an example of both these. So then I come to my expression. I have a new tab over here left. I can either do an expression or SQL query. So I can say, let's make this an actual expression that can be using the same function or operators that you use in, your SQL tags expressions or in property bindings, etc., where I can, use different mathematical logical operators, or I can use various functions in here, logic functions, strings, variables, all these functions you can use. I can then reference any other item in the group. They can be tags, they can be expression items, they can be whatever you'd like to reference. And I can say, okay, I want to look at sign 1 and do something like multiply it by 100.56. And I can then divide it by 10.45 or something. So that could be my expression. So as soon as I press OK, you're going to see now it's a triggered expression item. So it's going to be down here at the bottom. I'm going to set my group here to run to set. The trigger is going to be 0, so that it's not actually going to execute when for testing purposes here. Let's create another expression item that's going to be an item that's going to be on trigger, or sorry, always. So we're going to say, let's write this to nothing. We'll read it. We'll just use it as a read only in the group, and we'll make an expression as well, and we can do something very similar, whatever it may be. I just do times 15, press OK, and this EXPR, oops, always. Let's come down and make it to set it here to run always. So now you'll see the run always is going to be in the middle section, and the on trigger is going to be at the very bottom. I want both of these to just be, there we go. Hold on, let me go back and change this to go to my database field, EXPR. And so, okay, there's my two items. So as soon as I start this group up now, the group I saved the change there. The group is going to run at the update rate of the group, which means every 3 seconds right now. And you'll see there's no executions right now, but the expression item here that's on always is giving us a value. You can see the value is right there. The triggered expression doesn't give us the value, so nothing is actually happening. This value is not actually. It's waiting for that trigger on the group to execute. So as soon as that value or that condition goes to true, then down here at the bottom, we're going to see the group execute, and the EXPR gave us a value, and that now got put into our database. So just using the history group here, we can see examples of the items, OBC items, expression items, and triggered items there, where you can specify how kind of you want that group to execute. Now, the historical group is pretty standard in that you always take data from PLC and write it to your database. Again, you have other types of groups that you can use, like the standard group. If I just create a standard group here, again, we have the same type of items. We have the same status at the bottom. We have the same action tab where we have the update rate, data source, table name, the ability to store timestamps. But on the standard group, you're going to see there's more stuff available, like an update mode. On the history group, it's implied that it's going to the database. On the standard group, you can do whatever you'd like. So you can go from the PLC to the database, database to the PLC. You can go bidirectional. And down the very bottom here, we have the ability to not only insert records into our database, but we can update records in our database. I can update the first record, the last record, or some custom record based on the where clause that I've specified down here at the bottom. We have the same exact trigger tab here, where we can run the group off a trigger. And all the groups here have these things in common. It's just a matter of how you want to configure them to achieve your rescue management or downtime tracking, whatever it may be. And so really that's what part 2 of this course is going to give you. It's going to show you how to configure downtime groups and how to configure rescue management groups, or more advanced groups like that, to give you some functionality there. But I would encourage you to play with these groups. Create one of them, drag in some items, change some of the settings over on the action or trigger tab, enable the group, and see what it does. See how the values get put into the database or back into the PLC. So that will conclude the actual demonstration portion of the webinar. Again, we have probably a number of questions to get to over here. So I'd like to take this next 10 to 15 minutes to go over those questions you may have. So one question here from Bob is, Travis, can you compare the historical group with the history function within SQL tag setup? Well, that's a very good question. And if you remember last week in SQL tags, there is the ability to store history on a SQL tag. And the SQL tags history feature is a very nice feature in that it does history for you automatically, and you don't even need to know the format of your tables in the database, and you can drag it onto the easy chart, and it's kind of everything's working for you automatically. It does do data compression, but it's very simple to set up, but at the end point, you lose some of the flexibility you have with the SQL tags history, because you can't query it the exact way that you want to. So in this way, you would want to create a historical group inside of Ignition where you can force data to go in any format in the database that you want. You can do expressions beforehand and store it into your database. Once it's there, you can query it however you'd like. And you can query it on an easy chart. You can query it on a regular chart, pie charts, bar charts, whatever it may be. But you have more flexibility of not only can you interface with any other table you may have already configured by setting those target types or names, you can have it create your own tables that you like. That's kind of the basic difference between SQL tags history and the groups. SQL tags history is very easy to set up, but not as flexible as using groups. Another question here from Brian. Does Ignition use the item's name or item's target field when creating columns, specifically the name of the column? And the answer to that is yes. It uses that target field. If the target field is set to database field, then it will use the name as the column name in your database table. And one thing to note is that if I change that column name or if I delete one of the items in the group, the only thing, Ignition is not going to alter the columns that already exist. It's only going to add new ones. It's never going to delete a column or rename a column. It's going to always add a new one if you have some change. And of course, the data type you have on the item in the group is going to be the data type in the database. So if you change the data type, it's not going to change that in the database for you. You kind of have to do that yourself. So it's one thing to keep in mind. Ignition on the groups only add columns. Another question here from Adam is, can the trigger one shot on the rising edge only? And very good question. Let's go back to the designer here. And the answer to that is yes. If you look at the trigger tab, when you execute the group off a trigger, you can select the item, and then the first checkbox here is to only execute the group once while the trigger is active. So that way you can set a condition when it's greater than 0. That means on the rising edge, it's going to catch it, do something like write to your database or whatever you set the group up to do, but only do it once, and then wait for it to go back to 0, back to 1. It's going to wait for that rising edge again. So yes, just by checking that, only execute the group once while the trigger is active. If you have this unchecked, of course, it's going to continually execute at the update rate the whole time that value meets your condition down at the bottom. Another question here from David is, how do you sort OPC group items? So by default, the items here on the group are going to be sorted alphabetically. So you can come up here at the very top. No, actually, you can't. So you can't really sort it any other way except for it's just going to be sorted alphabetically in the OPC pane here. Now the expression items down the bottom, those expression items are going to evaluate in a sequential order from top to bottom. So you can move those up and down on that inside that pane, and that's what these two little icons right here are for, the up and down. So if I was to create another one, let's do this. So there's my test. I can then move these ones up and down, and because those are going to run in that specific order from top to bottom. So when the group actually executes, it's going to do this one first, and the next one, and so on down the line. But the OPC pane here, it's going to do it alphabetically. You don't have any options of actually changing that. In the very top right of the group, there's the pause. I didn't mention this earlier, but the pause allows you to just for a brief second, pause the execution because you may not want to go to your database at that time. So maybe you're altering your database, whatever it may be. That's different than actually, when you do the pause, you don't have to press save. That's the one nice feature about the pause. You don't have to press save. Everything else you do in the group, you have to press save in the designer. Another question here from Robert is, can we create groups via third-party config tool? And yes, you can. You can export these groups and import them through XML. There is a way to do that. We'll look at that XML format next week on the part 2 of this. But you can export to XML here. You can make any changes you want. You can import those back in. And of course, you can also attach notes to a group where you can say, hey, this group is going to do is doing X, storing history to my database with these 5 signed values. You can do that per group so that people can see what that execution is. The question here from Nettie is, why do you recommend using the OPC item rather than the SQL tag? So again, if we go back to the group here, I can reference the SQL tag in the item as an item, or I can, of course, use an item directly from the PLC. The main difference here is that if you have an OPC item, it's going to create an entirely new subscription at the rate of the group to your values. It means it's going to try to read from the value in the PLC at the rate of the group, where you can guarantee that the value will change. It's going to be the right value when the group is coming around to execution. Versus a SQL tag, you have a SQL tag is being updated by a scan class. So that scan class could be 10 seconds. The group could be set to 3 seconds. So by it being set to a higher rate, you're already kind of losing. You're not going to catch those value changes as frequent as you would if it was at the rate of the group. So the OPC items kind of guarantee you this, where SQL tags don't. But if your scan classes are set faster or equal to the rate of the group, you're not going to see a problem. It's just a matter of how you want, how you want to configure your project, essentially. All right, so it looks like we got to the end of all the questions there. If you have any more, I'll wait a few more minutes to see if there's any others that come through on there. But while I'm waiting, I want to thank you for attending today's session. Again, next week we're going to do part 2 of the transaction groups. I know this week was heavily PowerPoint and with a few examples there. But really I wanted to kind of hammer how the group executes and what the items are of the group. And next week we'll look at how we can then use all the stuff we learned today to configure downtime tracking, emergency management, and more advanced types of groups. So I definitely recommend to come back next week, same time, Wednesday at 9 a.m. Pacific Standard Time. If you haven't already registered for it, you can go onto our events page, and you can then call your account executive and you can register for that one. Get the link there to join up. So this is if there's any other questions. Again, I want to thank you for your time, and that concludes today's webinar. So have a very good day, and we'll see you next week.